Welcome to the Saving History podcast, the sanctuary for castle devotees and medieval history enthusiasts. Prepare to embark on a thrilling voyage through time as we unveil enthralling history and legend. From ancient folklore to cutting-edge restoration, we've got it all covered. So grab your headphones and let's dive right in.
Today, we sail the turbulent seas of the 10th century to meet a man who bridged two worlds. A Viking warrior who became a Christian duke, a raider transformed into a ruler. This is the tale of Rollo, the founder of Normandy and ancestor of kings. Join us as we unravel the legend of the man who changed the course of European history. This is Rollo, the Viking who became a duke. The year is 911. The once mighty Frankish Empire, forged by Charlemagne a century earlier, is fracturing. From the north, Viking raiders strike with impunity, their longships bringing terror to coastal communities and river towns alike. But on the banks of the river Epte, an event is about to unfold that will change the course of European history. Picture the scene. On one side stands Charles III, King of West Francia, known to history as Charles the Simple. On the other, a towering Norse warrior, his long hair and beard marking him as one of the dreaded Northmen. This is Rollo, a man whose journey from Viking raider to Norman duke encapsulates the transformative period bridging the Viking Age and feudal Europe. But who was Rollo, and how did he come to stand as an equal before a Frankish king? His origins are shrouded in mystery, contested by historians and saga writers alike. Some claim he was born Hof Ragnvalds's in Norway, the son of a powerful chief. Others argue for Danish origins, painting him as a warrior of humble birth who rose through the ranks. The truth, like the man himself, remains elusive. What we do know is that by the late 9th century, Rollo had made a name for himself as a formidable Viking leader. From the fog-shrouded coasts of Scotland to the sun-drenched shores of the Mediterranean, Rollo led his band of Norse warriors on daring raids. His name became synonymous with the Viking threat, a boogeyman to frighten children and a very real danger to the rulers of Western Europe. But Rollo was more than just another Viking raider. He was a man of ambition, of vision. In a world where most of his compatriots were content with plunder and temporary settlements, Rollo sought something more permanent. He saw in the fractured Frankish lands not just an opportunity for wealth, but for power, for legacy. As we embark on this journey through Rollo's life, we'll witness a remarkable transformation. We'll see a pagan warrior embrace Christianity, a raider become a ruler, a Norseman lay the foundations for a new French identity. Rollo's story is one of adaptation, of seizing opportunity, of shaping destiny. From the siege of Paris to the founding of Normandy, from brutal Viking raids to the complexities of feudal politics, Rollo's life spans a pivotal period in European history. His legacy would echo through the centuries, shaping events far beyond his lifetime. His descendants would go on to conquer England, Sicily, and even lead crusades to the Holy Land. But perhaps most importantly, Rollo's story gives us a window into a world in transition. Through him, we can understand how the Viking Age gradually gave way to medieval feudal society, how Norse and Frankish cultures blend to create something new, and how individuals could shape the course of history through a combination of military prowess, political acumen, and sheer force of will. As we delve into Rollo's saga, we'll separate fact from fiction, examining the historical evidence while acknowledging the power of legend. We'll explore the world he lived in, the challenges he faced, and the lasting impact of his actions. So join us as we set sail on this journey through time. From the fjords of Scandinavia to the fields of France, from pagan sacrifices to Christian baptisms, from Viking longships to Norman castles. The mists of time obscure much of Rollo's early life, but let us paint a picture of the world that shaped him, Imagine a young boy growing up in the late 9th century, either in the fjords of Norway or the flatlands of Denmark. The air is crisp with sea salt, and the rhythmic sound of waves forms the backdrop to daily life. This is a world where strength is prized above all, where the sagas of great warriors are recited around crackling fires, and where the promise of wealth and glory beckons from across the sea. Young Rollo, whether of noble birth or humble origins, would have been steeped in Norse culture and traditions. He would have learned to wield sword and axe, to read the stars for navigation, and to respect the old gods Odin and Thor. Perhaps he participated in his first raid as a teenager, feeling the exhilaration of battle and the thrill of plunder. By the time Rollo emerges into the historical record, he is already a seasoned warrior and leader. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions a Viking chief named Rollo raiding in England as early as 876. Whether this is our Rollo or another bearer of the name is unclear, but it gives us a sense of the timeline we're working with. Rollo's reputation as a formidable Viking leader grew throughout the 880s and 890s. Picture him standing at the prow of a longship, his hair whipping in the wind as he leads a fleet of Norse warriors across the choppy waters of the North Sea. His targets are the rich, poorly defended lands of England, Scotland and France. One particularly daring raid saw Rollo and his men navigate their ships deep into the heart of Francia. The sight of dragon-proud ships appearing suddenly around a river bend must have struck terror into the hearts of the Frankish peasants and nobles alike. Monasteries were particularly favoured targets, not just for their wealth, but because they were often unfortified. But Rollo was more than just a brutish raider. He displayed a keen tactical mind and a gift for leadership that set him apart from his peers. He understood the value of surprise, as well as the power of reputation. His men followed him not just for the promise of riches, but because they believed in his ability to lead them to victory. It's crucial to understand that in Viking society, leadership was not simply inherited. It had to be earned through prowess in battle, wisdom in council, and generosity to one's followers. Rollo excelled in all these areas. He was said to be of exceptional height and strength, a fearsome sight on the battlefield. But he was also clever, able to outmaneuver his opponents both in combat and in negotiations. One story, possibly apocryphal but illustrative of Rollo's reputation, tells of him being too large to ride a horse. Instead, he earned the nickname Rollo the Walker for his habit of travelling on foot. Whether true or not, it paints a picture of a larger-than-life figure, a man who stood out even among the formidable Norse warriors. As Rollo's power and influence grew, so did his ambitions. He began to see the potential for more than just raiding. The fractured nature of the Frankish realms, constantly squabbling among themselves, presented opportunities for a clever and powerful Viking leader. Why simply raid and leave when one could potentially carve out a permanent domain? This shift in thinking would lead Rollo to participate in one of the most significant events of the late 9th century, the Siege of Paris in 885. While historical records are unclear on Rollo's exact role in this event, many historians believe he played a significant part. Imagine the scene. Hundreds of Viking ships clogging the Seine, siege engines hammering at the city walls, while the desperate defenders fight to protect their homes and lives. The siege lasted for months, and although the Vikings ultimately failed to take the city, it left an indelible mark on both the Franks and the Norse. For Rollo, the siege of Paris may have been a turning point. He saw firsthand the wealth and power concentrated in the Frankish lands. He also witnessed the political divisions that made these lands vulnerable. Perhaps it was here that the seeds were planted for his future role as a ruler, rather than just a raider. As the 9th century drew to a close, Rollo was at the height of his power as a Viking leader. His name was known and feared across Western Europe. He had wealth, he had loyal followers, but he wanted more. The stage was set for the next act in Rollo's remarkable life, a transformation that would change not just his own fate, but the fate of Europe itself. The autumn of 885 dawned crisp and clear over the city of Paris. For the inhabitants going about their daily lives, it seemed like any other day. But on the horizon, a storm was gathering that would shake the very foundations of the Frankish realm. Picture the scene. The Seine River, usually a source of commerce and life for Paris, now choked with hundreds of Viking longships. The dragon-headed prows, so often the subject of fearful tales, were now a terrifying reality. At the head of this massive fleet, numbering perhaps as many as 700 ships and 30,000 to 40,000 men, stood some of the most feared Viking leaders of the age. Among them, many historians believe, was Rollo. The siege of Paris in 885 was not just another Viking raid. It was a pivotal moment in European history, a clash that would have far-reaching consequences for both the Franks and the Norse. To understand its significance, we need to step back and look at the political landscape of the time. The once mighty Carolingian Empire, founded by Charlemagne, was in decline. Charles the Fat, the Great, grandson of Charlemagne, nominally ruled over a vast territory, but his actual power was limited. The empire was fracturing, with local nobles increasingly acting independently. This political fragmentation made the Frankish realms ripe for Viking incursions. Paris, though not yet the capital of France, was a city of great strategic and symbolic importance. Situated on an island in the Seine, it controlled river traffic and trade. Taking Paris would give the Vikings a base from which to dominate the region. The siege began in November 885. The Viking fleet, led by Sigfred and Sinric, and possibly including Rollo, appeared suddenly before the city walls. The Parisians, led by Count Udo and Bishop Coslin, were prepared for an attack, but perhaps not for one of this magnitude. Imagine the terror of the Parisians as they looked out from their walls to see the river covered in ships as far as the eye could see. The Vikings quickly set about trying to breach the city's defences. They used siege engines, attempted to undermine the walls, and launched repeated assaults. But Paris held firm. The city's defences, strengthened after previous Viking raids, proved effective. The two bridges spanning the Seine, fortified with towers, were particularly crucial. As long as the Parisians held these bridges, they controlled the river. The siege dragged on through the winter and into the spring of 886. Both sides suffered from disease and hunger. The Vikings, unused to such prolonged sieges, grew frustrated. They resorted to launching diseased horse carcasses into the city, an early form of biological warfare. Where was Rollo in all this? While the historical records don't provide us with a clear picture of his specific role, it's likely that he was involved in the planning and execution of the siege. As a rising Viking leader, this would have been a crucial opportunity to prove his worth and increase his standing among his peers. The siege of Paris was more than just a military engagement. It was a clash of cultures and world views. On one side stood the Franks, heirs to the Roman tradition, defending their Christian city. On the other, the Vikings, still largely pagan, representing an older, fiercer way of life. Rollo, straddling these two worlds, may have begun to see the advantages of the Frankish system, even as he fought against it. As spring turned to summer in 886, the situation for both sides was becoming desperate. The Parisians were running low on food and supplies. The Vikings, for their part, were no closer to taking the city than they had been months earlier. It was at this point that Charles the Fat finally arrived with a relief army. But what happened next must have been a bitter disappointment to the brave defenders of Paris. Instead of engaging the Vikings in battle, Charles chose to pay them off. He offered the Vikings 700 pounds of silver and gave them permission to sail up the Seine to raid Burgundy. This decision had profound implications. It showed the weakness of the Carolingian monarchy and the growing power of local leaders like Count Udo, who had led the defence of Paris. It also demonstrated to the Vikings, including Rollo, that there were opportunities for gain beyond simple raiding. As the Viking fleet finally moved off from Paris in the autumn of 886, the city had survived, but the political landscape had shifted. Count Udo, the hero of the siege, would go on to become King of West Francia, breaking the Carolingian monopoly on royal power. For Rollo, the siege of Paris was likely a formative experience. He had witnessed firsthand the wealth and importance of the Frankish cities. He had seen both the strengths and weaknesses of Frankish society. Perhaps most importantly, he had observed how a Viking force could leverage its military might for political gain. The seeds planted during the siege of Paris would bear fruit in the coming years. Rollo, having learned valuable lessons about Frankish politics and warfare, would soon transition from raider to ruler. The stage was set for the next act in his remarkable story, the founding of Normandy. As the first decade of the 10th century drew to a close, the political landscape of Western Europe was shifting. The Carolingian Empire, once dominant, was in its death throes. In its place, new kingdoms were emerging, struggling to assert themselves against both internal rivals and external threats. It was in this crucible of change that Rollo would make his most audacious move yet. Picture the scene. It's the year 911. The place is Saint-Clair-sur-Epte, a small settlement on the border between Francia and the lands controlled by the Vikings. On one side stands Charles III, King of West Francia. On the other, Rollo, the Viking leader whose name had become synonymous with the Norse threat. The fate of a kingdom hangs in the balance. But how did we get to this point? To understand the significance of the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte, we need to look at the events leading up to it. In the years following the siege of Paris, Rollo had continued to be a thorn in the side of the Frankish rulers. His raids along the Seine had become increasingly bold and frequent, but Rollo was no longer content with mere plunder. He had seen the wealth of Francia, had observed its political structures, and had begun to envision a different future for himself and his followers. Charles the Simple, for his part, was facing challenges on multiple fronts. Internal rivals threatened his throne, while Viking raids continued to devastate his realm. He needed a solution that would allow him to focus on consolidating his power without constantly looking over his shoulder for the next Norse invasion. It was in this context that a radical idea was proposed. Rather than continuing the cycle of raid and reprisal, why not turn poacher into gamekeeper? Why not grant Rollo and his followers land in exchange for their protection against other Viking raiders? The idea was not without precedent. Frankish rulers had previously settled other groups on their borders as buffer states, but never had such a proposal been made to a Viking leader of Rollo's stature. It was a gamble, but one that Charles felt compelled to take. And so, in 911, Rollo and Charles met at Saint-Clair-sur-Epte. Imagine the tension in the air as these two leaders, so long enemies, came face to face. Rollo, the towering Norse warrior, perhaps still clad in the furs and armour of his people. Charles, bearing the trappings of Frankish royalty, the crown of Charlemagne's descendants upon his head. The terms of the treaty were extraordinary. In exchange for Rollo's pledge of fealty to Charles, he would be granted the land between the Epte River and the sea. This territory, which would come to be known as Normandy, was strategically crucial. It gave Rollo control over the mouth of the Seine, the very river he had once used to raid deep into Francia. But the treaty demanded more than just a pledge of loyalty. Rollo was required to convert to Christianity and to marry Charles's daughter, Gisela. In one stroke, the Viking raider was to become a Christian duke and a member of the Frankish royal family. The ceremony that followed has become the stuff of legend. As part of the ritual of fealty, Rollo was expected to kiss the king's foot. But Rollo, proud Viking that he was, refused to stoop so low. Instead, he ordered one of his warriors to perform the act in his stead. The warrior, equally proud, grabbed the king's foot and lifted it to his mouth, toppling Charles backwards. Whether this tale is true or embellished, it perfectly captures the tension and culture clash inherent in this momentous agreement. The implications of the treaty were far-reaching. For Charles, it provided a buffer against further Viking incursions and a powerful new vassal to support his rule. For Rollo, it offered legitimacy, land, and the opportunity to build something lasting. But the treaty also marked a pivotal moment in the transition from the Viking Age to feudal Europe. Rollo, in accepting the land as a fief from Charles, was entering into the feudal system that would come to dominate medieval European society. The Vikings, long seen as outsiders and destroyers of civilization, were now becoming part of the very power structures they had once raided. The creation of Normandy would have consequences that rippled through European history. This new domain, melding Norse military prowess with Frankish feudal structures, would become a powerhouse in medieval politics. Rollo's descendants would go on to conquer England, Sicily, and even lead crusades to the Holy Land. Yet, the immediate aftermath of the treaty was far from smooth. Rollo faced the monumental task of transitioning from raider to ruler, from pagan to Christian lord. He had to convince his Norse followers to settle down and adopt new ways of life. At the same time, he needed to gain the trust and loyalty of his new Frankish subjects. The conversion to Christianity, while perhaps initially a political move, would have profound implications for Rollo and his people. It opened the door to fuller integration into Frankish society and provided a common ground with their new subjects. Churches and monasteries, once targets for Viking raids, would become centres of Norman patronage and culture. As news of the treaty spread, it likely caused consternation among other Viking leaders. Had Rollo betrayed their way of life, or had he simply seen the writing on the wall, recognizing that the days of easy raiding were coming to an end? For the Franks, reactions were likely mixed. Some would have seen it as a capitulation to the Viking threat, while others recognized it as a clever political maneuver. The local population of what would become Normandy faced the prospect of Norse overlords, a daunting change after years of Viking raids. As the sun set on Saint-Clair-sur-Epte that day in 911, neither Rollo nor Charles could have fully grasped the historical significance of their agreement. They were focused on immediate political gains and the challenges that lay ahead. But in that moment they had set in motion events that would reshape the political, cultural, and social landscape of Europe for centuries to come. The Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte marked the end of Rollo, the Viking raider, and the beginning of Rollo, the Norman duke. It was a transformation that mirrored the larger changes taking place in European society, as the chaos of the Viking Age gradually gave way to the more structured world of feudal Christendom. Rollo, the man who had once been the scourge of Francia, was now poised to become one of its chief defenders and a founder of a new European dynasty. The ink was barely dry on the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte when Rollo faced his first major challenge as the newly minted Duke of Normandy. Standing on the banks of the Seine, looking out over the land he now ruled, Rollo must have felt the weight of his new responsibilities. The territory granted to him, while rich in potential, had been ravaged by years of Viking raids, many of which he had led himself. Now he had to transform this land from a battleground into a functioning duchy. Rollo's first task was to establish control over his new domain. This was no small feat. The territory that would come to be known as Normandy was a patchwork of different peoples and loyalties. Frankish nobles, many of whom had fought against the Vikings for years, now found themselves under the rule of their former enemy. The local Gallo-Roman population, long caught between Viking raiders and Frankish lords, watched wary to see what this new regime would bring. Imagine Rollo, the once feared Viking warrior, now having to navigate the intricacies of Frankish feudal politics. He had to learn quickly, balancing the expectations of his Frankish overlord, King Charles, with the needs and desires of his Viking followers and his new Frankish subjects. It was a delicate balancing act that would define the early years of Norman rule. One of Rollo's first acts as duke was to divide the land among his followers. This was crucial for securing their loyalty and providing them with a stake in the new Norman society. But it also introduced a new concept to these Norse warriors feudal land ownership. No longer were they simply raiders seeking plunder. Now they were landholders with responsibilities to their duke and to the land itself. The transition wasn't always smooth. Many of Rollo's Viking followers were reluctant to give up their old ways. There were instances of continued raiding, both within Normandy and beyond its borders. Rollo had to take firm action against these breaches of peace, demonstrating to both his Norse compatriots and his Frankish neighbours that he was committed to his new role as a protector rather than a raider. At the same time, Rollo had to establish the structures of governance for his new duchy. He adopted many Frankish feudal customs, but also retained elements of Norse law and tradition. This blend would come to characterize Norman society, creating a unique culture that was neither fully Frankish nor entirely Norse. One of the most significant aspects of Rollo's rule was his approach to religion. While his conversion to Christianity was likely more political than spiritual at first, Rollo seems to have recognized the importance of the church in Frankish society. He restored churches and monasteries that had been damaged during the Viking raids, and even made donations to religious institutions. This not only helped to legitimize his rule in the eyes of his Frankish subjects, but also began the process of integrating Norse settlers into Christian European society. Rollo's marriage to Gisela, daughter of King Charles, was another important element in this process of integration. While the marriage was political, it symbolized the joining of Norse and Frankish bloodlines at the highest level of Norman society. However, the details of this marriage, like many aspects of Rollo's personal life, are shrouded in historical uncertainty. Some sources suggest the marriage was short-lived and Rollo later returned to a previous Norse wife or partner. As the years passed, Rollo's domain began to prosper. The cessation of Viking raids allowed for the revival of agriculture and trade. Rouen, which became the capital of Normandy, grew into an important city. Rollo encouraged settlement and development, understanding that a prosperous duchy would be easier to govern and defend. But Rollo's ambitions didn't stop at the borders granted to him in 911. Over the years, he expanded Norman territory, sometimes through negotiation, sometimes through force. By the end of his rule, Normandy had grown significantly, laying the groundwork for it to become one of the most powerful feudal states in France. Rollo's relationship with the Frankish monarchy remained complex. While nominally a vassal of the king, Rollo operated with considerable autonomy. He defended his borders against other Viking raids, fulfilling his part of the bargain struck at Saint-Clair-sur-Epte. But he also engaged in power struggles with neighbouring Frankish nobles, always seeking to strengthen and expand his domain. One of Rollo's most lasting achievements was establishing a strong dynastic tradition. His son, William Longsword, was groomed to succeed him, ensuring a smooth transition of power, a rarity in this turbulent period. This stability would be a hallmark of Norman rule, contributing to the duchy's rising power and influence. As Rollo aged, he faced the challenge of ensuring the continuity of what he had built. The exact date of his death is uncertain, with estimates ranging from the late 920s to 932. According to tradition, as he neared death, Rollo had a final crisis of faith. In a bizarre episode, he allegedly had 100 Christian prisoners executed as offerings to the Norse gods, while simultaneously donating £100 of gold to the churches. Whether true or not, this story encapsulates the dual nature of Rollo's life and rule. A man caught between two worlds, forging a new identity that was neither fully Norse nor entirely Frankish. Rollo's transformation from Viking raider to Norman duke was remarkable, but it was more than just a personal journey. It represented a broader historical shift, the transition from the Viking age to the feudal era. Under Rollo's rule, Normandy became a unique blend of Norse vigour and Frankish feudal structure, a polity that would go on to play a crucial role in European history. The legacy of Rollo's rule would echo through the centuries. the institutions he established, the dynastic tradition he began, and the unique Norman culture he helped forge would have far-reaching consequences. His descendants would rule not just Normandy, but England, Sicily, and even parts of the Holy Land. The Norman people, shaped by Rollo's initial policies of settlement and integration, would become renowned as administrators, warriors, and builders, leaving their mark across Europe and beyond. As we close this chapter on Rollo's rule as Duke of Normandy, we see a man who successfully bridged two worlds. He took the martial prowess and adventurous spirit of his Viking heritage and combined it with the political structures and Christian faith of Frankish society. In doing so, Rollo laid the foundations for a dynasty and a culture that would shape the course of European history for centuries to come. As the sun set on Rollo's life in the early 930s, the foundations he had laid were only beginning to reveal their true significance. The legacy of this Viking turned duke would echo through the centuries, shaping not just the future of Normandy, but the course of European history. Imagine standing in Rennes Cathedral, where a tomb purportedly holds Rollo's remains. The grandeur of the Norman architecture surrounding you is itself a testament to the culture that grew from the seeds Rollo planted. But the true scope of his legacy extends far beyond these stone walls. First and foremost, Rollo was the founder of a dynasty that would shake the very foundations of medieval Europe. His direct descendants would rule Normandy for generations, each building upon the strong base he had established. His great-great-great-grandson, William the Conqueror, would famously invade England in 1066, forever altering the trajectory of British history. But the Norman influence didn't stop at the English Channel. Picture a map of 11th and 12th century Europe, and you'll see Norman fingerprints everywhere. In southern Italy, Norman adventurers carved out kingdoms for themselves. Norman crusaders established principalities in the Holy Land. From Scotland to Antioch, the descendants of Rollo's followers left their mark. The Normans became renowned as administrators, warriors, and builders. The feudal system that Rollo had adopted and adapted in Normandy proved to be a powerful tool for organizing society and projecting military might. Norman knights, with their distinctive style of heavy cavalry warfare, became feared and respected across Europe and the Mediterranean. In England, the Norman conquest led to profound changes. The English language itself was transformed, with an influx of Norman French words that we still use today. The entire ruling class was replaced, and a new feudal order was imposed. The Domesday Book, William the Conqueror's great survey of his new realm, demonstrated the Norman talent for administration and record-keeping. But Rollo's legacy wasn't just about conquest and rule. The unique Norman culture that began to form under his leadership would have a lasting impact on European art and architecture. Romanesque architecture, with its massive stone churches and castles, spread across Europe in part through Norman influence. The famous Bayeux tapestry depicting the Norman Conquest of England stands as a masterpiece of medieval art. In the realm of law and governance, Norman influence was equally profound. The Norman penchant for centralized authority and written records helped shape the development of common law in England. The exchequer system, a sophisticated method of financial administration, was a Norman innovation that would be adopted by other European monarchies. Even in the spiritual realm, Rollo's decision to adopt Christianity had far-reaching consequences. The Norman Church became a powerful institution, and Norman churchmen rose to high positions across Europe. In England, Norman bishops and abbots reshaped the religious landscape, building grand cathedrals and monasteries that still stand today. But perhaps one of the most intriguing aspects of Rollo's legacy is how it embodies a larger historical process, the assimilation of the Vikings into European Christian society. Rollo's transformation from pagan raider to Christian duke was replicated on a larger scale across Europe. In Normandy, Rollo's followers intermarried with the local Frankish population, creating a new Norman identity that blended Norse and French elements. This process of assimilation and transformation didn't erase Viking culture, but rather incorporated elements of it into the emerging medieval European civilization. the Norse spirit of adventure and exploration, their shipbuilding skills, their poetry and mythology, all of these found new expressions in Norman society and beyond. Consider the sagas and myths that grew up around Rollo himself. In the centuries after his death, he became a legendary figure, his life story embellished and romanticized. In some tales, he's portrayed as a direct descendant of Norse gods or ancient kings. These stories, blending historical fact with myth, demonstrate how Rollo became a symbolic figure, embodying the transition from the Viking Age to the feudal era. The political repercussions of Rollo's actions continued to play out long after his death. The establishment of Normandy as a powerful, semi-autonomous duchy within France would have profound implications for the balance of power in Western Europe. The Norman dukes, with their Viking heritage and Frankish titles, were often thorns in the side of the French monarchs, playing a complex game of loyalty and rebellion. In a broader sense, Rollo's legacy is one of cultural synthesis and adaptation. He showed that it was possible to bridge seemingly insurmountable cultural divides, to transform from outsider to insider, from destroyer to builder. This lesson would be repeated throughout history as different cultures clashed, blended, and created new syntheses. As we stand here in the 21st century, looking back across more than a millennium, we can still feel the ripples of Rollo's impact. The nations he helped shape, France, England, Italy, remain major players on the world stage. The Norman influence on law, language, and culture continues to be felt in countless ways, often so deeply ingrained that we scarcely notice it. In the end, Rollo's greatest legacy might be as a symbol of historical transformation. He personifies a pivotal moment in European history, when the raiding culture of the Vikings gave way to the feudal order of medieval Christendom. His life story reminds us that history is not always a tale of stark divisions between peoples or cultures, but often one of complex interactions, adaptations, and syntheses. From a Viking raider born in distant Scandinavia to the founder of a dynasty that would shape European history, Rollo's journey was truly extraordinary. As we close this chapter, we're left with the image of a man who stood astride two worlds, who helped bring the Viking Age to a close and ushered in a new era. In the story of Rollo, we see reflected the larger story of medieval Europe, a tale of conflict and convergence, of old ways giving way to new, and of the constant, dynamic process of cultural evolution that continues to shape our world today. As we've journeyed through the life and legacy of Rollo, you may have noticed a recurring theme: uncertainty. For all his importance in European history, much about Rollo remains shrouded in mystery. Imagine yourself as a historian piecing together the life of Rollo. You're standing in a dimly lit archive surrounded by ancient manuscripts, each telling a slightly different version of the story. Some contradict each other, others seem to stretch the bounds of credibility. How do you separate fact from fiction? This is the challenge that has faced scholars for centuries. Let's start with one of the most basic questions. Who was Rollo, really? Was he Norwegian or Danish? The debate over Rollo's origins has raged for centuries. The Norman chronicler Dudo of St. Quentin, writing about a century after Rollo's death, claimed he was the son of a Norwegian king. But many modern historians argue for Danish origins, pointing to contemporary Frankish sources that refer to Rollo as a Dane. This disagreement isn't just academic quibbling. It speaks to larger questions about the nature of Viking identity and the reliability of our sources. The Normans, eager to craft a noble lineage for themselves, may have preferred a royal Norwegian ancestry. But does this preference invalidate Dudo's account entirely? Or might there be a kernel of truth within the embellishment? Even Rollo's name is a subject of debate. In Norse sources, he's referred to as Hrolf, often with the nickname Ganger, walker, supposedly because he was too large to ride a horse. But was this his original name, or a later Norman invention? And what of the name Rollo itself? Is it a Latinized version of Hrolfr, Or something else entirely? The chronology of Rollo's life is another area of uncertainty. The date of his birth is unknown, and estimates for the year of his death range from 927 to 932. Even the date of the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte, arguably the most important event in Rollo's life, is disputed. While traditionally dated to 911, some historians argue it may have occurred a few years earlier or later. These uncertainties extend to many of the events we've discussed. Did Rollo really participate in the siege of Paris in 885? While many historians believe he did, there's no conclusive contemporary evidence placing him there. The story of Rollo refusing to kiss King Charles's foot, instead ordering a subordinate to do so, who then lifted the king's foot so high he fell over, is a colourful tale. But is it history or legend? These uncertainties arise from the nature of our sources. Much of what we know about Rollo comes from chronicles written decades or even centuries after his death. The earliest detailed account of his life, written by Dudo of St. Quentin around 1015, is as much hagiography as history written to glorify the Norman dukes, Frankish sources from Rollo's lifetime, while more contemporary often provide only fleeting glimpses. Archaeological evidence, while valuable for understanding the broader context of Viking settlement in Normandy, tells us frustratingly little about Rollo himself. Unlike other Viking leaders who left runestones or burial ships, Rollo left no such tangible traces. So, how do historians approach these challenges? They employ a variety of methods. They compare different sources, looking for areas of agreement and trying to understand the motivations behind disagreements. They analyze linguistic and place name evidence, which can provide clues about patterns of settlement and cultural influence. They draw on archaeological findings to build a picture of the material culture of early Norman society. But perhaps most importantly, historians have learned to embrace the uncertainty. Rather than trying to construct a definitive biography of Rollo, many now focus on understanding the process by which he became a legendary figure. They examine how the story of Rollo was shaped and reshaped over time, used by successive generations to serve their own needs and reflect their own values. This approach allows us to see Rollo not just as a historical figure, but as a cultural touchstone. His transformation from pagan Viking to Christian duke became a powerful symbol of the larger transformations taking place in European society. The ambiguities in his story allowed him to be many things to many people: a warrior to admire, a leader to emulate, a founder to venerate. In recent years, there's been renewed interest in Rollo and the early Normans, driven in part by popular media like the TV series Vikings. This has led to new research and re-evaluations of old evidence. DNA studies have been proposed to settle the question of Rollo's origins, though the difficulties in definitively identifying his remains make this challenging. As we conclude our exploration of Rollo's life, we're left with a figure who is part man, part myth. The uncertainties surrounding him are, in a way, fitting. Rollo lived in a time of transition, straddling two worlds. It's perhaps appropriate that he remains elusive, slipping between the cracks of history. What we can say with certainty is that Rollo was a pivotal figure in European history. Whether Danish or Norwegian, whether he kissed the king's foot or not, he founded a dynasty that would shape the course of medieval Europe. His life story, with all its ambiguities, continues to fascinate us, offering a window into a transformative period in Western history. As historians continue to debate and new evidence comes to light, our understanding of Rollo will undoubtedly evolve, but some mysteries may never be solved, and perhaps that's for the best. For in the gaps between what we know and what we can only imagine, Rollo lives on, forever the Viking who became a duke, forever bridging the world of Norse sagas and Frankish chronicles, forever embodying the complex, transformative spirit of his age. As we reach the end of our journey through the life and legacy of Rollo, we find ourselves standing at the intersection of myth and history, where the Viking Age gives way to medieval Europe, Like the statue of Rollo that stands in Rouen, we've constructed an image of a man who was larger than life, yet rooted in a very real and tumultuous time. Rollo's legacy reminds us that history isn't always a story of conquest and replacement, but often one of integration and transformation. The Normans didn't erase the existing Frankish culture of their new homeland. They absorbed elements of it, added their own contributions, and created something unique and powerful. But perhaps Rollo's most enduring legacy is the reminder that history is often made in unexpected ways. Who could have predicted that a Viking raider would become the founder of a dynasty that would shape medieval Europe? Rollo's story is a testament to the role of individual agency in history, how one person, seizing the opportunities presented by their time, can set in motion events that echo through centuries. As we bid farewell to Rollo, we're reminded that history is not just a record of past events, but a living dialogue between past and present. The story of this Viking turned duke, with all its drama and complexity, continues to captivate us, to challenge us, and to shed light on our own times. So the next time you hear the word Norman, or ponder the intricate connections between Scandinavian and French history, or wonder about the Viking influence on medieval Europe, remember Rollo. Remember the raider who became a ruler, the pagan who became a Christian duke, the outsider who became a founder of a new order. In his story, we see the complex, often surprising ways that history unfolds, and we're reminded of the enduring human capacity for adaptation, innovation, and transformation. And thus concludes another chapter in our ongoing exploration of medieval history. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time. If you've enjoyed today's episode and want to delve deeper into the fascinating world of the Middle Ages, I invite you to join our community on Patreon. Find the link in our description or search for the Saving History channel on Patreon. Our subscribers get access to exclusive bonus episodes, early releases, and a wealth of additional medieval content. Don't forget to subscribe to Saving History on your favorite podcast platform to ensure you never miss an episode. Remember, in understanding our past, we gain insight into our present. Until our next historical adventure, this is your host, Hunter, encouraging you to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep saving history.